Hello, this is Dr. Flight, and in this segment, we're going to look at target marketing and the idea of segmentation in markets. And what we want to do is we want to determine a group of consumers that is best suited to buy our product or to consume our product so that we can position it properly for them in the marketplace. So one of the challenges is to make a target market decision and identify specific target markets or segments that we will try to reach. And in this video, in this lecture, we'll look at different criteria that we can use to segment the market. And specifically what we want to talk about are psychographic characteristics of an individual. And we'll look at adopter groups and different ways people think about buying products through the product life cycle. So target market decisions will be the focus of this segment. In this segment, we want to spend some time talking about different target market issues and specifically consumers, and thinking about how we define consumers as we begin the pre-launch stage. Big issue deals with identifying who your customer is going to be and who the product is specifically designed for. So we think about different ways to what we call segment the market. So in marketing, we have generic markets that are interested in a specific in a broad product category or category of products that meet one specific need. But what we try to do is take a generic market and find smaller groups of consumers that have something in common with each other. So we take a heterogeneous generic market and look to break it into smaller groups of homogeneous consumers that again are similar to each other on some measure or some criteria. So a lot of times we think of segmenting criteria as related to how customers use the product, or some type of demographic criteria, or maybe psychological criteria or something along those lines. So we move into things like customer profiles, and then we talk about adopter groups, and then what we're going to do is to spend a little bit of time thinking about mass customization and an era of time that we're in currently, where micro marketing and mass customization is a really big influence that we have right now. To start with, though, I want to think about this idea that we had earlier, where we were looking at different types of swimsuits that varied on various degrees of comfort and fashion, which were two again important features, or what we call determinant attributes, that are important to customers. And what we had was 3 different customer profiles based on different groups of customers who had different interests. So what we have here are 3 different market segments. Market segment 1 is interested in fashion and less so interested in comfort. So they want to look good, but they don't care as much how the swimsuit feels as long as it looks good. Segment 2 would prefer more comfort over fashion, so they're okay to sacrifice some fashion, but they would prefer to feel good in their suit than necessarily how it looks. Segment number 3, they really want the best of both worlds, and actually segment 3 is probably the least satisfied with any of the products that are out there. They are probably the least represented with products out there based on where our current swimsuit brands are on this perceptual map. But what we want to do at this point now is, if we know that segment 2 is a customer that we're really interested in, then we're going to want to know that customer and know them well. We want to know how to reach them. We want to know how they purchase, what they buy, who they buy with. We want to think about how price sensitive they are, and so forth. So we know that segment 2, They want a lot of comfort and they're willing to sacrifice fashion to get it. But one tool that we can use is something called a customer profile. And this customer profile would be a written description or a document that we write where we describe the typical member of segment 2, the customer, typical customer in segment number 2, and to the point where we even know like where they live and what their lifestyle's like, how price sensitive they are, the different ways they communicate, and so on and so forth. What we really want to know is we want to be able to actually, kind of picture through words and describe in depth everything we can about the typical customer in segment number 2, because if that's the group that we want to sell to, we need to know everything we can about them in order to give them the product that they want. And without doing that, then we're not going to be able to position our product well in the marketplace. One of the concepts here is to understand the psychographic types of properties that these individuals have. And so we can certainly measure things like where they live and how much money they make and whether they're male or female and so on and so forth. But those types of criteria that describe a market aren't always the best. Typically, the best types of criteria that we can use in order to be able to reach a customer would be things that deal with how they feel and their attitudes and the way they think, and how they live emotionally. Now, these things are very difficult to measure, but these things are called psychographic properties, and they're ways that we group or regroup or segment consumers, and tend to do very effectively. So here's some examples of psychographic customer properties, consumer properties, like how adventurous somebody is, how risk loving they are, in other words, how willing they are to be their own person, things like social integration, cosmopolitanism, social mobility, and privilegedness. So these types of things have to do with a social structure based on environment, based on attitude, based on a lot of income, based on a lot of things all rolled up in one to make a person. And then if we can think about that person, kind of psychographically, then a lot of times we can reach them better through advertising and product placement and so on and so forth. We can actually, get to know them like we would a friend. How well you know your friend is oftentimes, not like the surface stuff, like where they live and whether they're male or female or how old they are. That's not really what tells a person what a person is, but these other psychological types of dimensions are. So when we segment markets, when we get to know customers, when we write that customer profile, we want to think about kind of where they're coming from an emotional perspective in order to really reach them effectively from a marketing sense. Another way we think about this in context of products and in context of the product life cycle would be through the notion of adopter groups. So this is probably something you're already familiar with, but it's really a function of a psychographic property that we use to segment, and we think about the people who buy our products over time as having different psychological makeups or conceptions. So the innovators then are very venturesome, and they're eager to go out, buy new products. They're receptive to new ideas. They tend to be very successful individuals. Early adopters are people who buy after our innovators. They're still very well sought after as opinion leaders, and they tend to be very socially connected. So they could be market mavens, for instance. They could be people who spread the news about our product very effectively, to link those in the market to each other with them. So they might be real influencers, in other words, who are still risk takers, but they're respected among the people that they're with. So they participate more in community organizations than others, and so forth. So innovators and early adopters, they're the people who buy products first, but it's driven oftentimes by some psychological aggressiveness to the market and willing to take risks that others are not willing to take. Later on in the product life cycle, we have other adopter groups. There's a total of 5. There's the group called the early majority. Okay, so roughly 34% of the market is in this group of consumers. So over a third of the buyers who will buy your product are in this group. They display less leadership potential, but they're still ahead of the curve, if you will. They tend to be active in community affairs. They don't necessarily want to take unnecessary risks, but again, they want to be on a trend. They want to be on a trend that might be taking place. So they need some proof, they need some evidence. They're not as risk-loving as the early adopters or the innovators. They need some evidence to see that the product will be successful for them. We finally have the late majority buyers. Again, this group is as big as the early majority. The late majority consumers, again, represent 34% of the market. And then finally, we have our laggards. And so the laggards are very risk averse. They don't like to take risks at all. They want to make sure whatever technology is being delivered, it's delivered in a way that's proven and sure, and they want to be confident about what's going on and so forth. Okay, so again, these are all psychological makeups, but they lay nicely with our product life cycle curve, the PLC, which we've talked about a lot. And again, this is kind of a consumer behavior issue where we talk about how consumers think and feel. And so if I'm launching a new product, there's very, very little reason for me to try to reach late majority or laggards in any of my advertising and any of my product positioning. So like it might be that I have a very, very large market, but at this point in time, I might only be trying to reach innovators and early adopters in my communication plan. So even though my market is super large, I'm really at this point only trying to reach about 15, 16% of it. And so if you think about it that way, it is helpful because I can better target and position my communications to those who are really most likely to buy the product now, rather than those who are less likely to buy the product who lie later on in the product lifecycle curve. So identifying different market segments through psychographic properties is a key concept to grasp as we move forward and we think about the branding of our product and so forth. There is an idea here that in this period of time, there's a break, or they call it a chasm. So there's sort of this break that's happening right here in this period of time between the early adopters and late majority. And you can kind of group these guys together, and then you can kind of group these guys together. And this is called, they call this crossing the chasm when you move from here to here, because there's a very different type of consumer that ultimately buys at that period of time. So these guys who are early on here, we call them visionaries. We see them as functioning together, as kind of drawing in the rest of the market and foreshadowing maybe what else will happen for this particular product category. The rest of these consumers, all these other guys, are called pragmatists in this theory called crossing the chasm. Okay, so when we think about these two groups, we have visionaries and pragmatists, the innovators and early adopters. They clearly differ on how they view purchasing. They differ on how they view innovation. They differ on how they view the product's role in their particular lifestyle. So pragmatists do not use visionaries necessarily as their opinion leaders. So they still rely on a lot of outside experience, not necessarily from visionaries, but from proof or evidence that the product is going to work in use. So they need to see a product that is being used, that will last, that has some permanence and so forth before they jump in. Visionaries may snap up a cool cell phone, for instance, while the pragmatists may just be looking for something that works well but isn't necessarily too expensive. And so they're not going to be necessarily thought of as jumping in on a fad that will pan out over time or not. They'll be very risk averse from there. But these two groups of consumers are thought to be kind of groupable, if you will. The early adopters, or the earliest adopters being the innovators, and the early adopters, and then the second group being a large portion of the percentage of the market, would be everybody after that, or the pragmatists in this particular sense. So there's some research and some thought brought to this idea of moving from that group to the next, and perhaps even staying in the visionary group. And so as the visionaries start to finish up buying the product, launching a new product to replace the old one. So again, the electronics type of a concept where we launch a new video console for gaming, just as the other one is reaching the growth, the peak of the growth, the fastest growth stage, we're replacing it with a new one. We're bringing out a new product to replace it. That might be thought of again as kind of hitting the high season on your product replacement plan. So we want to think about how we're launching our products and whether it's applicable to those people who are in various stages of the product life cycle. That would be an important concept. To cross the chasm, then, we want to be able to relate our product to both the consumer who buys early, the visionary, but then somehow we need to make sure that this product becomes relatable to the pragmatist as well. So a strong value proposition or a strong positioning statement for a particular product would include buying motivations for both the pragmatists and for the visionaries. But just keep in mind, this may be very difficult to do. It might be that you launch the product and you only end up reaching visionaries, and then some other company, a follower, somebody who's coming up after you, is able to pick up where you leave off and capture the rest of the market, and the rest of the adopters along the line. Okay, so in this little segment here, we talked about different segmenting thoughts, and in particular customer profiles, and also the various 5 adopter groups that we see across the product life cycle time period. And then finally we talked about crossing the chasm, and in particular visionaries and pragmatists.